I've got some good news, bad news, and good news to share with you today. The good news is, obviously, if you're following the news, the COVID curve is starting to flatten. The level of infections and deaths, thankfully, is starting to recede a little bit. The bad news is, unfortunately, there is a lot of infection and death with which we've had to live over the last month or so. I think the number of deaths in this country is up over 21,000 now, which is just heartbreaking. And I think as we move forward, as you well know, our lives are going to change in light of this virus. On top of that, there'll be a level of fear, and the sting of death is going to resonate with us as human beings for the weeks and months to come. But the good news is, for us as Christians, the good news is we can interact with these realities with soberness and with practicality. But the reality is, as Christians, we can live triumphantly over the reality of death, the reality of sin, and the reality of temptation, as we'll see in Hebrews chapter 2 in just a second. Because the author of Hebrews really does, in showing us the humanity of Jesus and the care and the compassion and the power of Jesus, the author is conveying to us, to me, four things that we can really hold on to today. The first thing is that the power of death has been destroyed, not nullified or paid for in a sense. I love the language. The power of death has been destroyed. Secondly, the fear of death and the bondage that comes with being afraid has been nullified. Thirdly, the reality of sin in our lives has been paid for, and in its place we've been given righteousness. And then fourthly, even when we stumble and fall, when we're tempted, when there are those situations where we feel like we can't bear up under this new righteous name, even there God is with us in our temptations. So if you want to, turn to Hebrews chapter 2, and in verse 14 through 18, the author gives us these four wonderful points. He begins and he says, "For since the children are flesh and blood," that's you and I, "he likewise partook of the same." Jesus became a man for us. He likewise partook of the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. The 2 points here are, as I mentioned, number one, the power of death has been destroyed. Now, we're going to die physically, but spiritually we are going to live with Jesus for eternity. And that is a triumphant fact that we can hold on to today. The second thing, and a little bit more practical, is the reality that the fear of death and the bondage that comes with that has been completely nullified by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And you think about this bondage and this fear of death. Many people are standing in lines at the supermarket or on the bus over the past couple of weeks with the reality that the person standing next to them or sitting next to them could be carrying a fatal disease that could very easily jump to them and kill them. And that's a very sobering thought that we've all had to live with. However, the fear of death and the bondage that comes with it as a Christian is completely nullified in our lives. Now, the author goes on and continues and says, he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Once again, Jesus is with us, he identifies with us, and he is on our corner to help us. And the author continues again and says, for in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are being tempted. The last 2 points there, the idea of the propitiation for sins. Sean mentioned this word a couple of videos ago. The theological reality is that the anger, the penalty for sin, the payment for sin, for human sin, has all been poured out on Jesus Christ on the cross. Propitiation means God's anger for sin, and the payment needed for sin has been satisfied and turned away by the death of Jesus. And in turn now, Jesus, as we believe in him, his righteousness is imputed or given to us. And so our sin has been replaced by righteousness. And even when we don't live necessarily righteous lives, when we're tempted or we stumble or we have difficulty with the old man, the old sin nature, even then Jesus is in our corner to help us when we're tempted. He is a great, merciful, faithful high priest who knows exactly what we're going through because he dwelt bodily in the form of a man. So as we move into April and May and June and we are living in the shadow of COVID-19, we can live triumphantly knowing that God is for us. And if God be for us, who can be against us?